Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be returning to the Wolverine state to talk about politics in Michigan, specifically the state's upcoming 2026 gubernatorial election. This is shaping up to be a really interesting and unique race, so we're going to start talking about it now, and I envision we'll be talking about it a lot within the next 15 months. So just to give a little context, Michigan obviously is a very competitive state. It's been within 3% the past three presidential elections, and most recently Donald Trump carried the state by a little under 100,000 votes. And this was a good performance for Trump. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the candidates in Michigan's gubernatorial race and go into a bit of detail on why I think this race is going to be really interesting. And then we're going to return back to, of course, the kind of the elections part of this, which is that Michigan is already a very interesting state. So in this election, you might notice, and you can do this by looking at Wikipedia or reading the news, especially if you live in Michigan, it's going to probably be a three-way race, and it's going to be between the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, as usual, and in addition to those two candidates that we're going to get, we're going to have an independent Mike Duggan. Now, there are often on the ballot third-party candidates, right? Like you will see maybe there's a libertarian candidate, there's a writing candidate, there's a green candidate, maybe there even is an independent candidate. But what matters more are independents that get traction or even libertarians that get traction. And in this particular race, Mike Duggan is the former mayor of Detroit, so he has a bit of a profile, and he's a former Democrat. So he has really been able to kind of make a name for himself, and he's been in Michigan politics for a while now, so he isn't kind of like a no-name who's just running to get 1.3% of the vote. He's going to do well, and he's going to have a real impact on this race, and that's why this is so interesting. Now, on the surface, I think you could argue that Mike Duggan is a pretty clear spoiler for Democrats, and I'm pretty sympathetic to that theory just because he was the mayor of the state's largest city. That is, of course, very Democratic, even in 2024. If you look at Wayne County, which is where Detroit is, Kamala Harris still got well over 60% of the vote here. Now, this was a bit of a decline from Biden in 2020 and even Hillary Clinton in 2016, but nonetheless, it's still a blue area. It's still the biggest Democratic, kind of vote sink in the state, and that is why Mike Duggan running has made Democrats a little nervous. And so when you have the mayor, who is a former Democrat, who ran on more Democratic and left-leaning policies, as the mayor of this bigger city, what you're kind of looking at is someone who on paper should take away more votes from Democrats, and that might happen. Mike Duggan, if he gets a fair number of votes in Detroit, it's more likely than not that he'll be taking votes away from the Democratic nominee than the Republican nominee. And so I think to start, we'd probably be better off to assume that Duggan will be a bit more of a spoiler. I don't think he'll take away 0 votes from Republicans, but I think at least as of what we know from right now, or at least what we know as of right now, I should say, Duggan will probably begin with more name recognition among Democrats in the bluest part of the state. That inherently makes me think he's going to be a spoiler. Now, the one thing I would note is that Democrats have been more aggressive in the early stages of this campaign to kind of tie him to the GOP. They've already kind of called him a spoiler. They've already, called him out for certain things. The Michigan Democratic Party is really not happy with him in this bid for governor. But the other thing that might be interesting is, and this is really what we're going to have to wait on, we have to see what kind of campaign Mike Duggan runs. If he runs a campaign that is critical of Democrats from the left, and if he runs a campaign that is maybe critical of Gretchen Whitmer, then I could certainly see him taking away votes from Republicans from Democrats, right? If he criticizes Gretchen Whitmer from the left, if he criticizes the state party from the left, if he does it in, kind of a way that maybe is more appealing to progressive voters who have felt kind of alienated from the party, especially in 2024. And then, of course, there's another avenue, which is that maybe he runs a more moderate campaign. That's kind of going to take away more votes from either party, because if you run in the middle, maybe you'll get some moderate Republicans or some moderate Democrats. Or there's also a chance that he runs a kind of critical, like a campaign critical of Whitmer and the status quo, but in a way that's more conservative, right? And I think that there's some signs he's kind of doing that just based on him kind of calling out failed Democratic leadership, which is something that Republicans kind of do, right? Talking about issues that have become more conservative coded, like crime, that's a big one. And so there's a chance, it depends on, again, how he runs the campaign, but maybe you could say, based on the rhetoric he uses and how he approaches the race, that he begins to take away more votes from Republicans. But I think for now, based on what we know, it would be a little reckless to make that assumption, even though I'm open to changing my mind. Now, enough with Mike Duggan. I just wanted to talk about that because I think this is like the big variable in the race. Now, let's talk about the Republican and Democratic candidates. So start with the GOP because I think it's a bit easier. They are very likely to nominate Jon James, who is a current member of the House. He's from the Macomb County District. So if you take a look at the House election results, he beat Carl Marlinga by around 6%. It was a little less than that. This was a pretty good performance. He only won by, a couple thousand votes in 2022. So he did a lot better this year. And obviously, he was aided by Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. We saw Trump do exceptionally well in Macomb County this year. He won it by 14. This was a county that voted for Barack Obama. That was an 8-point win for him for Trump in 2020. So he did about 6% better there in 2024. Overall, it was a good year for Republicans in these working class districts in the Midwest, and Jon James kind of benefited from that. But that's not to take away from him. I do think he's a pretty good candidate in terms of electability, and I say that because he's actually run statewide before. Now, he was the GOP nominee for U.S. Senate in 2018 and 2020, and he lost both times, but I'd argue that both his performances were pretty impressive. I think 2018 is actually really interesting because Jon James, he only lost by 6.5%, and that might sound like a lot because, again, Trump, even in 2020 when he lost Michigan, he only lost by 2.8. So you can say, okay, well, Jon James did, a full 3.5% worse than Trump, even more than that. But I'd like to argue, first of all, Debbie Stabenow, who was a Democrat, she was the U.S. Senator. She was a pretty popular candidate. She won by 20 points in her previous run back in 2012. And 2018 was a really good year for Democrats across the Midwest. Mind you, Sherrod Brown won a Senate race in Ohio that year. Bob Casey and Tammy Baldwin cruised to landslide re-elections in 2018. And Democrats obviously fared pretty well across the country, as that was kind of the last blue wave year we've seen to date. Now, the thing about Jon James, and this is going to be particularly interesting, is that not only did he do better than fundamentals in 2018, he also actually outran Trump in 2020 against an incumbent Democrat in the Senate, Gary Peters. Now, Gary Peters was not as strong as Debbie Stabenow. He was kind of known to be, ironically, a senator with less name recognition, but nonetheless, James outran Trump by around 2% against an incumbent senator, which is no easy feat. He did especially well in the suburbs. He did a lot better than Trump in Grand Rapids and in kind of the more educated parts of the state, but he did a little bit worse in Macomb County, which is ironic because that's where he ended up winning the House seat. So he isn't like, the dream candidate for Republicans, but he's a good candidate. He's above average, and I think he's probably the best they could get in Michigan. And that's worth something because he is obviously, this is a winnable race. Now, for the Democrats, they have a pretty stacked field, but it looks like it's going to be Jocelyn Benson, who is, of course, the current. She's a statewide official with short advantage, but she's the current Secretary of State. She won re-election by nearly 15% in 2022, and she's been able to do quite well historically. So I think she's actually a pretty good candidate in her own right. Now, what's interesting about Jocelyn Benson or about this primary with Benson, is that there are other Democrats, namely Garland Gilchrist, who's currently the lieutenant governor. Garland Gilchrist, I think, would also be a fun candidate, but he's probably going to lose the primary just because he is not he's a statewide official, but he's never won a statewide election before. He's been on the ballot with Gretchen Whitmer, but he hasn't won statewide yet. So that could certainly hurt him. That's why I think he's losing in the polls, because he just hasn't been voted for at the top of the ticket yet. Or I should say, as his own candidate yet. That's a better way to phrase it. So it'll probably be Jocelyn Benson versus Jon James. And now, this is still a winnable race for Democrats. I know, Mike Duggan getting 10 to 12% of the vote might seem like it's going to hurt Democrats, but in Michigan, historically, especially in the Trump era, gubernatorial races have been pretty, Democratic leaning. In 2022, Gretchen Whitmer won by 11% over Tudor Dixon, who is not a very good candidate, to be fair. But nonetheless, this was a really, this was a pretty decisive showing overall. And then in 2018, obviously, she beat, Bill Schuette by a similar margin, even though this was an outgoing Republican administration. So Democrats, at least locally in Michigan, have fared pretty well. And without Trump on the ballot, Republicans in the Midwest in both 2018 and 2022 kind of struggled with turnout. So we'll see if that changes. We'll see how that pans out, especially in off-year elections. But overall, this is going to be a really interesting race. Now, the one thing I want to say as we kind of conclude the video, I think this is a kind of good, like a good introduction point. Now that we know who the candidates are and what the dynamic is, we have to talk a little bit about Michigan's, just like the politics here, because this is obviously a really close state. And there's a lot of things that could go right or wrong for Republicans here. I think they have a good opportunity to flip this seat, maybe even more so than they do in Wisconsin or certainly in Pennsylvania. And that isn't only because of Mike Duggan. That's because Michigan in 2024 swung the most towards Trump out of any of the big three Rust Belt states. It moved towards Trump by more than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania by a pretty good amount. And it actually moved to Trump, Trump more than even Iowa or Ohio. It saw a 4.5% swing to the I think almost, it was a 4.5% swing to the GOP, which is pretty decisive. Now, Democrats do have a bit of a problem here, and it's actually kind of relevant because Mike Duggan's running. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Detroit, Wayne County has really been bleeding for Democrats. I mean, go back to 2012. Look at how well Barack Obama did there. It is exceptional. I mean, Mitt Romney and John McCain never stood a chance in a state like Michigan, where Barack Obama had such good turnout in cities like Detroit. And he was actually, part of it obviously is that Barack Obama was better at getting higher black turnout for Democrats. He was also better, just with raw like percentages. Some exit polls in 2012 showed Obama won nearly 95% of black voters, which is crazy. Biden won 90%, maybe 91%, depending on the exit poll. Kamala Harris probably won 88 to 89%, which is still a big margin, but not 95%, certainly. Nonetheless, the problem Democrats have here is on top of decreased black turnout for the past decade, they have been unable to win over white working class voters. And obviously, in Detroit, in Wayne County, you have a lot of white working class voters. This is also a problem for Democrats in Macomb County, which is why Kamala Harris did a full 5% worse than Joe Biden there. So overall, this is a really, really big problem for Democrats, because Michigan is still a state. They have, it's still a big auto industry. You still have a lot of votes to be gotten, or to be earned, I should say. I don't think that's proper grammar. Excuse me. Right. But there are still a lot of votes to be earned with these working class voters. And Democrats have done okay with, right? Democrats talk about Obama's numbers with these voters in 2012 like it's like like a mythical thing that happened a billion years ago. It was only 13 years ago, which to be fair is a long time, but obviously politically 13 years trends can be overcome. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's happened before. And also in 2018, if you look at elections in the Midwest in 2018, Democrats still held on to those voters. It is really post-COVID, Democrats have bled a lot more even than they did in the first few years of Trump with these working class voters. So overall, something to kind of think about, something to really consider here, and it's something that I think everyone should be watching. Republicans have a good chance to play offense here. Democrats have a chance to potentially turn the tide, and I think that the party that does that will probably be favored in this race. Of course, I don't want to simplify. I don't want to, just make one narrative. Obviously, Democrats feel good about what they're doing in Grand Rapids. They feel better about Kalamazoo and kind of the western part of the state, and they might hold up okay in Oakland County. But I think that here, Democrats have, in the past decade and a half, kind of lost hundreds of thousands of votes, and I think 2026 is a good time for them to start trying to fix that. And for Republicans, go on offense. Like, they can win. They can absolutely win the Senate race. They can win the gubernatorial race. And they have Mike Duggan being in the race gives them a good lane to do so. So let me know what you think. I'm really excited to see how this race pans out. I'm excited to see how Duggan runs the campaign and whether or not he's actually going to take away from Democrats and Jocelyn Benson. But I'll be keeping you all posted.